Hello, this is the Fate of the Arts podcast, episode 8. I'm Anthony Etherin, and my guest this time is Lori Wike. So, good to see you again.
Great to see you, Anthony.
Let's just get started with the bassoon and how your journey, how you got started with the bassoon and how you ended up principal bassoonist at the Utah Symphony Orchestra.
Yes, I started the bassoon right when I started junior high, and I didn't have much of a musical background prior to that. In fact, I wasn't really sure what a bassoon was. And the band directors for my school, I took some sort of musical aptitude test, and they suggested, "How about the bassoon?" And I said, "Great, what's a bassoon?" And I fell in love with it immediately. I mean, literally from the first week that I had the instrument in my hands, and began studying it quite seriously, really within a few months. And I was lucky to have a wonderful teacher in town at the time, who was there for 2 years. And then I was able to travel across the state to study with another phenomenal teacher during my junior high and high school years. So that was how it all got started for me.
We've talked about this before on a previous podcast, and something I'd never thought about was how you have to make your own reeds. So, so you decided you're going to commit to learning this instrument, learning this skill, and then you're immediately told, no, you've got to learn this other completely different skill on top of it.
Yeah, yeah, that it's, very much this kind of artisan craftsmanship that's involved in constructing reeds. And it's the reed plays such a huge role. And so it can be a little unsettling to be so dependent on two pieces of cane vibrating together in terms of how one is able to perform in high pressure situations. So it's quite an art in terms of learning how to make reeds and coming up with one's own, what works individually for oneself as a player. So it's quite the journey. And I again was lucky to have some really remarkable teachers or from early on.
Yeah, because I think of because I'm a guitarist, and I think of how
Hmm.
how guitarists, not me necessarily, but a lot of guitarists I know obsess over getting the right guitar tone.
Hmm.
I'm a bit lazy in that regard. I'm happy with anything, but some guitarists really do. So when you're making a reed, you're essentially doing the same thing. You're looking for your distinctive tone. But you can also change the tone, can't you? Because there are different ways to make the reeds. If for a certain performance you want a certain sound.
Absolutely. And I'm a big proponent of making different reeds for different circumstances, for different types of pieces that I'm playing. So I'll have a whole box that's just full of reeds. It's labeled Rite of Spring, So the Rite of Spring begins with a very high, touchy bassoon solo. And I like to always know I've got a good box of reeds that I can depend on and pick which one I happen to like whenever that piece comes up. Um, and I have other specialty reeds as well. And it's not so much that I'm designing the reed to be something in particular. It's more like seeing what does this vegetable, this particular piece of cane want to be. If a reed is favoring the low register, I'm not going to make it try to play the ultra high bassoon solo in the Ravel piano concerto. I'm going to cultivate the tendencies in the reed because there are, we can be very systematic about it in terms of designing the reeds in all of the different steps, measurements, all sorts of different things. But there are still variables that can't quite be accounted for. And again, one of my first teachers was also a physicist, and he would just say, cane, it's a vegetable, So a very systematic approach, and yet, there are things that exceed that in the cane and in designing these reeds. And so I'll have, kind of my general everyday read, but I have lots and lots of specialty reads as well that I like to just write what they excel at on and keep them for when those pieces in the repertoire come up next. Makes life a little less stressful that way too.
Yeah.
And I think it's also more interesting because you have very characters, you can go for different tone colors and you're For me, I would say yes, sound is the prime characteristic I'm looking for. Um, More commonly, you'll hear the advice that one should prioritize response first. And I would say definitely when taking, auditions, that's a good idea. But for me, in some instances, I'd rather work a little harder if I'm in order to get the sound that I hear in my head and that I want to produce on the instrument. So there are different schools of thought with regard to that and bassoon reeds.
Is every reed different? Even if you think you're going in the same direction, you've got the same kind of material to work with. Is it really the case that they're all unique?
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah, each read is just slightly different. I mean, you're aiming for certainly a certain level of consistency in terms of pitch and within a range of tone color in terms of what one wants to produce. But each read has, its own little quirks, I would say, regardless of how systematic one goes about in their construction.
Well, I won't get stuck on reeds, but I do find it I find it fascinating, just like I say that analogy to finding guitar tones. Uh, but
It's both
so
fascinating and the bane of my existence. So,
oh yeah, you've mentioned this before. Yeah,
yeah.
very annoying, I imagine. But you've been very successful with these reads. Principal bassoonist at Utah Symphony Orchestra, and I know that in the last couple of years you've had an issue with the concert hall, your main concert
Oh,
hall.
yes, yes. So we are so incredibly fortunate here. We play in this really a truly marvelous concert hall. Its name is Abravina Hall. And a couple of years ago, in mid 2024, we found out that this concert hall was most likely going to be demolished for a new kind of downtown revitalization project and the creation of a sports and entertainment district. And it was absolutely devastating news. One, because it's a great concert hall, and these things don't grow on trees. It's extremely hard to build a great concert hall, regardless of you could have the greatest acoustician, acoustic designer, um, and all of the modeling in the world, but it's not always predictable. Again, there's an art involved to that science. And this concert hall was designed by the premier acoustician of the time, Cyril Harris, who also designed the Metropolitan Opera House and the Kennedy Center. Another situation there, of course. Anyway, so in the other aspect that made this such devastating news was that there's no way that this would not have that it would not pose an existential threat to the orchestra. If the orchestra survived that, it would, pretty much be in name only. I thought my way through that in every possible, in every possible way to try to imagine an outcome that wouldn't be devastating, and I couldn't because of the level, the number of years of displacement for the ensemble that it would involve, and the lack of appropriate and available venues in which we could perform. So it was a very difficult situation, and so we're not only going up against local government and to some degree state government, but also the interest of a billionaire developer. So it was no small task to try to save this concert hall, and many people worked very hard to save this, and a committee of musicians in the orchestra was formed, and I was put on that committee, and it definitely took over my life for a considerable period of time. I was the person focusing on historic preservation possibilities and in charge of research in general. So lots of legislative code and figuring out, consulting with architects to understand master plans and public records requests, things of that nature. So it was a really on the one hand, from an intellectual level, it was quite interesting in terms of the strategy that was involved and learning a great deal about local politics and, participating in the political process in ways that I had never done in the past. I'd never spoken at council meetings, things like that. It 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 was quite a new experience for me, and at the same time, it felt like we were up against something impossible, and it was 100% a done deal months before the public ever found out, that it was slated for destruction. And to undo a done deal, it's no small feat. So it was it was a very difficult and also interesting experience. And I'm happy to say that I believe that the hall now is is safe and will be maintained. And I spearheaded the efforts to get it placed on the National Register of Historic Places here, which, while it doesn't provide particularly strong legal protections, it had a huge role, I think, in changing the conversation and shifting kind of overwhelming public sentiment in favor of preservation of the hall. And it also, we got a lot of media press related to the process of getting it placed on the National Register, and found this wonderful local preservationist who wrote the nomination, which, often takes years to do a nomination like this. And she did it in 48 days. And I'll be forever grateful to her, Adrienne White. And anyway, it was remarkable how we did so many things on such a compressed timeline, and were successfully able to save the concert hall and preserve it, for future generations.
Yeah, well, congratulations, both on saving the hall and on having the strength to enter into that world of politics and
Many,
bureaucracy.
it's something, it's quite something, yes.
So, do you think was just a bit of misfortune, a wrong time, wrong place, or do you see this as indicative of something bigger that's going on?
Yes, that's really interesting. And so I do have some thoughts about that. So, in some of my many speeches given during that time, I would cite the fact that, our hall was designed by the same acoustician, designed the Met Opera House, designed the Kennedy Center, using these as examples of prestigious halls that one could never imagine being torn down. And the great irony, of course, is that the Kennedy Center is very much threatened right now. So to see that happen, just a couple years later, and it's unclear exactly what the future holds for the Kennedy Center, and it's a very different situation with certainly additional complexities involved. But I think that for these large performing arts organizations who are certainly dependent on having, venues in which to perform, it's and typically they don't own these venues. So, maintaining these relationships and maintaining access, even when one is considered a resident organization, you might not own the hall, but you're the resident organization. So for the Kennedy Center, the resident organizations are the National Symphony Orchestra and the Kennedy Center Opera House Orchestra, and so they're in a very concerning position right now. And then, in terms of, is this indicative of something else? I would say, at least here in the US, there is a move to devalue the arts and humanities in a more explicit way than has been in the past. And it involves having kind of a framework of considering value based on ROI, on return of investment, and having that return on investment being measured solely as earnings, upon graduation. So this affects, our colleges and our universities, the whole kind of pipeline in which people are trained to become artists or who are trained in the humanities. And There are significant threats at the federal level, and actually even more egregious threats, I think, happening at state levels. I've spent a lot of time kind of researching this, but there are these right-wing think tanks that develop legislation, and they find state legislatures that will then kind of run these things, and it's very difficult, and it's involves kind of removing funding. And I'll give you one example. Indiana University here has always been known as a premier music school. It's a state university, so anyway, but the Indiana legislature just passed a bill the other month, and it puts the Bachelor of Music degree from Indiana University at threat of disappearing entirely because the graduate earnings do not meet a certain threshold in a certain period of time. And on the federal level, the threat right now is more about removing the possibility of having student loans for programs that that do not meet the so-called threshold of value. So there's lots of details involved in that, but again, it's this evaluative framework of the arts and the humanities that has to be challenged. And this just ridiculously narrow idea of value determined solely by earnings, which certainly in poetry, this value is just not going to be determined by earnings, and there's so much
I hope
more
not.
to significance and value and importance. So I do think that we're seeing really concrete threats, particularly in the U.S. Right now.
Yeah, I mean it's not a new conflict, is it? I mean, this has always been
Sure.
around. Is your art useful or not? And then the other side arguing, well, does art need to be useful? And this is a perennial argument, but it does seem like things have swayed a certain way in the last few years, especially in
Indeed.
the US, but also elsewhere. The,
Yes.
the UK too, to some extent, maybe not quite the same extent. But yeah, it's disturbing. But the one thing we can hold on to is that this conflict has always existed, and
True.
it will swing one way, and then it will swing the other. We
Yeah,
hope.
the pendulum always swings, and I certainly hope it starts swinging in the other direction soon.
Mhm. So that's one threat that
Yes.
that your profession is facing. But this obviously in this podcast, I want to talk about how things have changed over the last 20 or so years and where they might be heading. So what have you noticed in your career? Because you've been doing this a while now. What other things have you noticed changing about orchestra performance?
So one thing that has happened probably primarily within the last 10 years has been the rise of films and concert in terms of programming for symphony orchestras. And this is, I don't know if you're familiar with this, but it's where a film is projected and the orchestra performs the musical soundtrack to it live. And so it becomes a wildly, different experience from, going to the cinema to see a film or certainly watching one at home. And it's immersive. It's, again, this kind of shared event that happens. And the music being in a concert hall like that is incredibly, immersive. It allows people to experience, often, very popular films that they love in a new way. And it's been, I think, a real boon, financially to symphony orchestras as well. And again, there's an irony involved in this. We just did. We've done several films this year. We did the Wizard of Oz. We did Empire Strikes Back. We did Up. But we were doing Empire Strikes Back, and I remarked to a colleague, it's a little bit like the musicians strike back, with these films in concert, because here in this country in the 1920s, we had, about 20,000 orchestra musicians employed in music theater orchestras. 1927, the jazz singer, the rise of the talkie, and you had the American Federation of Musicians, which is our musicians union, doing everything that they could to stop this. They formed a Music Defense League, I believe it was called. Anyway, they were unsuccessful, and by the early 30s, those 20,000 musicians, those jobs had completely disappeared. So, it was this way in which this new technology threatened the existence of, a very large component of the profession for performing musicians here. And and now, we have this irony of here we are, and these films and concerts are becoming quite popular all over. And I was reading a little bit more about it, and interestingly enough, there is some form of AI that is used, especially with older films, take to remove the music portion of the soundtrack while leaving perhaps singing or things like that. And of course, obviously the noises, the sounds, and the dialogue preserved. So, in one sense, that's an example of a new technology proving to have a positive impact, at least in this one very narrow example
Mm.
for performing musicians.
We might talk about some of the bad things going on with AI, but certainly that the ability to do things like that or to recreate old movies, AI is extremely useful in this way. I wanted to ask you what your experience of performing at these things is like. Do you perform the same way? Are you a bit more self-conscious or less self-conscious, knowing that people are looking at a screen rather than you?
Yeah, it's interesting because you don't have the kind of flexibility that you have in a typical concert performance because everything is tied to what's called a click track. Typically, the musicians don't have the click tracks in our ears, but the conductor will probably have a click track or they'll have a visual click track in front of them, depending on the film. And so everything has to be very precise. It has to align perfectly with the visual element of the film. But I'm not opposed to constraints, and so I don't think that that's necessarily a negative thing in any way. It is a different method of performing for sure. And for me, I mean, I'm a huge film lover. I minored in film studies, and I actually, during my undergraduate years at Eastman, I fell in love with live film accompaniment at the George Eastman House, where there was a theater and a resident pianist who would improvise and to silent films. And to hear again live performance with these silent film classics, I really fell in love with that. And there was a book, or perhaps an essay that the silents were never silent. They always had this live accompaniment, and I loved that combination of recorded, media, the recorded medium combined with live performance.
Yeah, that's really nice then. It's really nice that you get to do this,
Yeah,
having been
I
such a
I
fan.
I think it's great, and I think it oftentimes people will come to these concerts who may never have attended a symphony concert, and it's or people will say, "Oh, I don't like classical music," but they perhaps love film music and they love video game music, and so it's not necessarily about developing new audiences. I mean, it doesn't have to lead to anything else, but I think it's there's incredible film music out there and film music composers, and I think it's great that we're performing this and that it's also helps us be sustainable at the same time.
Yeah, and it's true that it's good to bring new people in. Throughout your career, have you felt that accusation of perhaps just not being with the times?
Yeah, I mean, ever since the headlines since I've been reading them since in high school, oh, the death of the symphony orchestra, the death of classical music. And, I think it's still going, pretty strong.
It's doing all right. Yeah,
Um, yes, but obviously, everything has to evolve and to change and to transform in a way that responds to one's environment. And I think that there are ways that symphony orchestras have, continued to grow and expand their repertoire in ways that is very important, and in ways that is meant to reach ideally everyone, and not just perhaps kind of certain stereotypes of who would attend a classical music concert. And again, I think there's something there for everyone. It's music, but it's so-called classical music. It really involves so many different types of music. It
Mhm.
really spans the full spectrum. So I do think that many people are pleasantly surprised to find out sometimes that they do indeed like classical music.
Yeah. Do you think the internet has been a force for good in that way? I'm thinking in particular of, well, a couple of things. But let's start with YouTube, where you have channels like Samuel Andreev's. Samuel will be on
Sure.
this podcast when he's finished moving house. And there's another one, the Music Professor. Have you seen that channel? It's a
I haven't, no.
composer called Matthew King. That's a very good channel too. So you've got these YouTube channels of people explaining classical music,
Right.
which it makes it much more accessible to many people. Have you felt the impact of that, do you think?
I haven't thought about that specifically, but I certainly think that, there's a kind of almost the ease of accessibility that's provided by these YouTube channels. Back in the day, you had Leonard Bernstein's Young People's Concerts, which were kind of famous, these lectures on music, and he had this, real gift for conveying, you know, uh, what's happening in these musical compositions to a wide audience. And so I do think that, again, the accessibility provided by the internet allows for that in a new way, and allows for engagement in a new way. Of course, then you're dealing with recorded music, and the differences between that and live performance.
Hmm. On the subject of live performance, of course, during COVID, where being a bassoonist was a bad idea, people shunned you. This person who's blowing air out everywhere. Let's keep away from them. But you did uh, you did some performances online, didn't you?
We did, and these were very challenging to do. So the way that worked is we would each person would record their own part using a click track in their ears, and then those were kind of assembled in the editing room. So very strange and kind of surreal thing to just play, one's part if there are 85 other parts happening, right? And so it only coalesces into an actual performance in its edited form when it was compiled together. And yeah, we did some really interesting projects during that time because of course we were not able to perform together. For we were actually one of the first American orchestras that went back to playing live, and we had constructed a very robust safety plan that worked quite well, thankfully. But it was very challenging. The COVID happened, and we had a major earthquake here in Salt Lake, and then the next week we were furloughed in the symphony. So it was that all happened in the space of 3 weeks, and it was quite a time for sure.
Have those online performances continued in any small capacity, or do you think it was just for COVID?
Well, I one of my colleagues, our principal clarinetist, he at that time I was showing him how to, do use apps to create kind of multiple channels and things so that you could perform with yourself. And he really took it next level. So we his name is Tad, and we call it the four Tads, and then the five Tads, and then the nine Tads, because he plays so many different instruments, and really some just remarkable work that he has done. And I experimented around doing bassoon quartets with myself, things like that, and trying to have some fun during a very upsetting time.
But there haven't been any big scale online performances
Uh,
since COVID.
Not that I have participated, and I'm sure that some exist.
The last interview I did, I interviewed Christian Book. We were talking
Mhm.
about how the art world changed during COVID, and you had all these virtual galleries online, and people were saying, "Well, this is going to be the future of the art world," and it doesn't really seem to have come to pass. I think when COVID ended, people they really wanted to go back out into the world. The last thing they wanted to do was stay at home and do Zoom calls
Yeah,
like we're doing now, and go to virtual galleries.
it's true. I think people were really hungering. I mean, our ticket sales just went way up, you know, once, especially once we returned to a full kind of season of performances versus kind of the way we limped along the first year following COVID. But uh, yeah, I think, you know, pedagogically, the transformation has stuck to some degree in that, you know, in my university job, I suddenly had to teach my lessons over Zoom, which is a little challenging, you know, with the way the audio can work there with instruments. But it and so that enables, you know, I can teach a lesson to a bassoonist in North Carolina, for example, and it's not the same as doing it in person, particularly with an instrument like the bassoon, where it's like, here, let me see what's happening here. Let me look at this, you know, let me look at your reed. All of those things can't really be done as effectively, if at all, in an online format. But I do think that, you know, there are, you know, modes of teaching that have persisted to some degree, that can be thought of as opportunities still.
Yeah, because of course you are teaching the bassoon to how many students do you have currently?
I have three students at the moment.
Is it still a popular instrument? Are
It's as
people
popular
enjoying
as
it?
it's ever been.
Yeah, that's good to
Um,
know. Very good to know.
yeah, you know, it's certainly not as popular as an instrument like the flute or the violin, something like that. But there are a shocking number of bassoonists out there in the world.
And the future looks good for the bassoon.
I would say so, yes.
Very good. So this has been positive so far. So let's make it a bit more negative.
Okay.
I'm going to turn the page on my notes to the negative side. So AI, obviously, I'm going to talk about. And for anybody who doesn't know, and they should know, Laurie is a great palindromist, and this is how we know each other. So recently, I got sick of posting palindromes on social media and having people reply saying, "Did you use AI to help you with this?" Because as you know, that AI is hopeless at writing palindromes.
Utterly hopeless, incapable.
So I asked AI, I asked Gemini, just explain to me now, why is AI so bad at writing palindromes? And it actually gave me a very good answer. So what I did was I said write a palindrome using the word spider, and it came out with all this nonsense. And then I just replied just off the cuff. It's not a very good palindrome, but I replied with spider art, rare dips, just to show that it's not that
Sure,
difficult to come up with something.
exactly.
And so I asked it why it couldn't do this. And its response was, and it said it's because when it looks at the word spider, it doesn't see a collection of letters. It
Right.
sees basically a single holistic unit. And so, and it actually held the phrase, asking me to reverse this is like asking me to reverse the color blue, which is that's like a clever thing for AI to say, but
Mhm.
also admitting that it doesn't really understand things the way humans do.
Right.
And then it went on to talk about how it's a statistical prediction engine. So
Hmm.
it predicts the most likely next word in a sentence. And of course, in a palindrome, you don't get that, or you rarely get that. You normally get something weird because the constraint has led you to do this with palindromes. It's led you to say something very odd and unexpected.
Right.
My first thought when I saw this was, okay, you're not just saying that you struggle with palindromes. You're not even just saying that you struggle with constrained writing. You're saying that you actually struggle with creativity because
Mm,
it's not just palindromes where the next word is weird and unexpected. It's
right.
pretty much all
Right.
creative writing, that creative writing should surprise people. It shouldn't just be the most predictable thing. And I don't know if you heard the first episode of this series where I was talking to
Right, I
James,
did. I did.
and I said then the problem with AI writing isn't that it's bad, it's that it's mediocre, pretty much by design.
Yes, it's
And if you listen to
homogenized. Yeah.
yeah, and if you listen to AI music, same thing. It's not you wouldn't say it's terrible, but there's nothing exciting or vital about it. It's
Right.
bland. Yeah, sorry, I've talked for too long there. That's my little AI rant. I'd like to get your thoughts on it.
Yeah, so I love that we did, a very similar thing with one of these LLM chatbots and as large language models, these chatbots again, they've scraped, millions and millions of text, created by actual humans, and it becomes kind of homogenized and regurgitated out into a flattened you know, form. So it has, incredible genre mastery on some level in a very abstract way, but there's no experience of the particular and of the unexpected. And I think what lies there in creativity. And then as, again, because the LLM forms of AI tech they work probabilistically rather than deterministically, they cannot possibly produce a palindrome. So I've had friends who've said, well, okay, so they're not good at palindromes, but they're not good at writing palindromes yet. I'm like, no, this form of AI tech is never going to be able to write a palindrome. And I think, if you can find a hook, like, okay, why can't, you know, this form of AI write palindromes? I think it allows one to really start to understand the architecture, at least in a working way, not necessarily a very detailed scientific way, but give one a working mental model of what's happening with this form of technology and to start to understand some of its limitations, which I think are widely I think there's so many misunderstandings about what an LLM chatbot is capable of and what it is not capable of. So, yes, I did something very, very similar using the chatbot Claude and asking it to write a palindrome with Claude itself, and again, just same sort of results, something that not even a palindrome at all, really struggles with it. And the other thing I noticed is that it was also unable to identify palindromes. At one point in my quote unquote conversation with Claude, I had typed in a palindrome I had written, and it said, "Oh yes, and the last line itself, it ends on a palindrome. Am I AI?" I was like, "Am I AI? That is not a palindrome. I am AI is a palindrome." But it gets really close, and again, probabilistically,
But it feels it,
that's
doesn't it?
fine.
It's almost like
Yeah.
it can see when something looks. I don't want to use words like it intuits or it feels because it's not doing
Hmm.
any of those things.
Right, right.
But it seems to intuit or feel the cadence of a palindrome.
Yeah, I think there's something to that. It's had just enough training on palindromes to have a little bit of a sense of, something that's close to one. And I noticed the same thing with vertical acrostics. And I had, written this acrostic palindrome sonnet. And, the vertical acrostic, the first letter of each line spells elude demon in me. And Claude responding to this said, "Oh, I see the acrostic, elude me demon." And I'm just like, I'm just staring at it. Like, how is that even possible?
Like, how could you get so
Again,
close but be so
so
far off?
close and yet
Yeah.
so far. So it's very illuminating for me and kind of my first forays in trying to understand how this technology works and what it's capable of.
I have I don't know if this is might be too much to go into. I have a poem, a triolets
Hmm.
called Murder of Crows.
Hmm.
Maybe you remember it.
I
It's
think I do. Yes.
yeah, so as in like with a lot of triolets, you make the repeated line say something a bit different each time.
Hmm.
And in the case of this one, it starts with the line, a murder from a garden rose. So it's saying that a murder of crows from a garden
Hmm.
rose up. And the
Sure.
next time it comes back, it's uh, well, it has the sky is red now, no one knows, a murder from a garden rose.
Right.
So murder there means like a killing,
Sure.
and garden rose has become a compound, so a garden rose. So it changes. And I fed this poem into ChatGPT and I asked it to analyze it. And it came back with a very good analysis of the poem that showed it completely understood it. I asked it, how do the parts of speech change
Hmm.
across these lines? It couldn't do it, it couldn't understand. It said, no, they're the
Mm.
same line. They're doing the same thing. So
Interesting.
how could it understand the poem as a whole? And then when you ask it to focus on details, how could it then just completely undo its previous understanding?
Yeah, it's fascinating, and it's kind of, I think something happens for people who are using LLMs for kind of work things. I've only used an LLM essentially for experiments, but they'll be happy with the output, and then they try to get it to change one little thing, and it can't do that. Suddenly, everything is completely different. So it's really responding, to each prompt in that conversational text exchange genre that one is engaged with in when conversing with an AI, kind of as an entirely new thing. So I don't know, that's really quite fascinating, but I think it's just truly, truly interesting, the exploration of what it can and can't do, and the effects on us, and the effects of, the kind of projections of what we attribute to these LLM chatbots are, propensity for projecting a sense of intersubjectivity, to project this, this kind of illusion of understanding, to know we're interacting with an LLM chatbot, I know very well, but nevertheless, it feels like I'm having a conversation, things like that. So I think it's a very concerning and also fascinating subject.
Yeah, exactly. This is what's so concerning about it. The fact that it does present itself as though it's human, and so you can't help but think that the entity you're talking to reasons like a human being. But there's so much
Right.
evidence to show that it doesn't. It doesn't think like us at all. It thinks in its own weird alien way. It's just that then what it presents to us appears human. And
Right, because we're
I prefer it if it just spoke to us like an alien.
well, yeah. I mean, and particularly with a chatbot like Claude, it has a name, versus if it were to just, be called, something like ChatGPT or the pattern matcher, something like that. And it's, I did several experiments with, asking it, analyze, the ways in which you are contributing to this illusion of intersubjectivity, in this previous response, things like that. And it's just, yeah, it's really quite remarkable. And we, of course, as humans, we're used to disembodied text. We're used to letters. We're used to emails. We're used to disembodied text and imagining a consciousness that was behind that text. So, again, with an LLM that has a complete mastery of the conversational text genre, it's very difficult not to fall into that sense. I sometimes use the metaphor of, it's like Tom Riddle's diary is writing back to you, something like that, or the character of the demon Moloch in the first season of Buffy, since I know you love Buffy as well.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so strange. I mean, because I know that this is not a human being I'm talking to,
Right.
and yet
And yet,
when it's polite to me, I'm polite back. When it really annoys me, I get angry with it. I treat it like a human being.
right, we can't, to some degree, we can't help but respond that way. And even knowing it, even being able to analyze it, going back and forth, even challenging, like, okay, what are the ways in which that previous response, blah, 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 it's still performance the next time as well. It's just, a meta performance, which is still a genre, right? So it's quite a tricky thing. Yeah. And
Do you think we're at a dangerous point now with how much we're trusting to AI?
oh, I definitely think so. Yeah. Yeah. I've been, reading a lot recently about uses of AI in healthcare, of which there are many incredible applications,
Mm.
but most of these are very specific forms of AI, more like symbolic AI, or sometimes called good old-fashioned AI, a type of AI that is used for one very specific task, rather than these kind of generalized text machines that are the LLM chatbots. And when LLM chatbots are being used, like to refill psychiatric prescriptions, and and when researchers are testing, for alignment to test to see, can we break these safeguards? The LLMs, they don't they don't do very well, and so it's quite concerning, and it's concerning in terms of liability questions, things like that. There's a particular company that is being piloted. It's being piloted as a use case here in Utah, and if you look at the terms and conditions, it says this, is frequently incorrect. Do not rely on this for medical advice whatsoever, So it's absolved of any kind of legal liability, and yet the marketing is exactly the opposite. It's like it's your AI doctor, right here. So there's very little regulation, and what actually got me interested in LLMs to begin with was it's pretty recent for me. I really didn't pay them any attention for the most part until this past fall. And it was a study about adversarial poetry. And I just love that term. But adversarial poetry, being able to jailbreak LLM safeguards in a single prompt, and that being particularly. And I read the study, and it's really more adversarial riddles. And being someone who loves puzzle poetry, I thought, wow, riddles, interesting, And basically, it's a riddle in verse form could shift registers with an LLM so that it pattern matched to this is wordplay, this is I'm answering a riddle. And in these tests, the researchers were able to get the LLMs to, again, respond with information that they were not supposed to be able to give to a person prompting it. And again, it's because of this register shift capability. So knowing again that the porosity of the safeguards that are engineered into these chatbots is even more concerning, particularly when you see you know instances of wanting to use wildly inappropriate use cases for LLM chatbots, like fully autonomous things. We'll just leave it at things. Things that they cannot and should not be used for, and the level of misunderstanding at very high levels is just so deeply concerning. So cause for concern, but I still remain fascinated with the technology at the same time.
Yeah, but that's, I mean, I'm in agreement. It's not a case of AI is evil. It's,
No, no,
I mean, the AI is going to do so much good as well as the evil.
sure, sure.
In that first episode, talking to Jane, Jane and I both hit on the same idea at one point, which is that if writers and musicians are all going to be replaced by AI, or at least uh, demonetized by it, the one thing we always have is performance.
Right,
So, and I think I joked about, well, I could get, maybe people will pay to watch me write palindromes live.
right.
And Jane talks about improv, and
Hmm.
she made a very good point about improv being, it's not, what you see is not going to be the best theater you've ever seen, but you don't watch it because it's great theatre. You watch it to see the human element of people struggling to improvise, to come up with ideas on the spot, and then the laughter of when they get it wrong, and all the mistakes the mistakes are part of that art form. And I think with music too, even before AI, one of the problems that music has had over the last 20, 25 years, on the recording level, not the performance,
Hmm.
live performance level, on the recording level, is this leaning on things like auto tune and
Hmm.
quantization and making these really neat, tidy, perfect recordings where everything's
Right,
tight. And
right,
to the extent that the music loses its personality.
exactly.
So I wonder anyway if music and perhaps all arts are anyway destined to go back to being real, live human experiences. And AI and overly tidy recordings will fade into the background and people will focus more on actual human interactions and human experiences. Is that idealistic or I mean, as somebody who is in your line of work, surely you're going to be on my side here. Yes.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I listened to that episode and I was thinking a bit about I don't know if you know the Roland Barthes essay, The Grain of the Voice, but again, it talks a little bit about again that kind of that the particular, again, which is something that is so foreign to AI and so incredibly human. We're beings in time, and particularly when performing, this is, it's there. It's a connection, and there's something. The things that are most human, I think, will, I would hope, become even more valued when we're confronted by this. And yes, there are certain things, AI can really, it really excels out, but things like that, improv, or I did a little thought experiment, with, you know could an LLM play the game Mornington Crescent? That seems the kind of the peak of something that AI is simply incapable of, in terms of judging the moment at which, with the game of Mornington Crescent, as the saying is, you say Mornington Crescent, the best time to say it is right before your opponent is going to say Mornington Crescent. You could start out by initially saying Mornington Crescent, but that's not playing, that's not being sporting. So it's things like that rely on time and a shared connection in time, that human element. I think that there's potential for those to be valued even more highly.
Yeah, and I think that we need to have another look at what we mean by art. Like art is not the end product, art is the process,
Right,
and that's what we
right.
should focus on. And and the other thing I want to say, because as a musician that I don't want to accuse you of anything, but I'm just going to throw something out here and say I bet you've made lots of mistakes when performing, yes? Because
Of
every
course,
every
of
musician has.
course.
And that's part of it too. Before we started this podcast, I was listening to the Rolling Stones, just
Hmm.
put a couple of songs on. So many mistakes. You can hear the mistakes. And you don't get that in recordings that have come out in the last 25 years because everybody's obsessed with sanitizing everything. And it doesn't sound as good now as it did back then. And live
Yeah.
performances, you don't want somebody to make a mistake. You're not gunning for them to fail, but you expect that there'll be that variance of someone plays a note slightly off or slightly behind, and it just makes it better than the perfect performance. A perfect performance is boring, surely.
Yes, I agree. And I think that perfectionistic mindset is also, really quite toxic. And, I'm philosophically, in terms of music, I mean, there is often this real drive toward perfection, especially when one is auditioning, as a classical musician. And I think it can be quite stifling for creativity and, the kind of micromanaging, that kind of level, I think is just not very interesting versus performances that are full of character and that are in the moment. And again, these variances, I
Mm.
think that's part of what makes them so interesting. And a mistake is, I think, generally inconsequential. Doesn't mean I like to make them, but it's, um, I think that there's a different approach versus, aiming for an impossible perfection, always ever vanish, the vanishing point of perfection, right?
Mm.
And yeah, it's again, sanitize. That's a really good word. You use the word sanitize there. And I think that's interesting. I have to just, I laughed so hard about your anecdote where you recorded some poems and, um, you know, they thought it was AI.
Yeah, I know. I
Like, no,
still don't,
that's me. I have a robot voice.
yeah, I still don't know how to take that, honestly.
I laughed a lot.
I do, because it's one of two things. It's either that I sound like an actor, I'll take that, or I sound like a machine. So I don't know. Bit of both, maybe.
No, I think it's just you have such a compelling uh, voice. I've always loved when you've read your poems, and I'm so glad that you've been recording them more and more, big recording projects. So yeah, it's
Yeah. Oh, thank you. Thank you.
I think it's a positive thing, but I found the anecdote very funny.
Yeah. Everything is going to be accused of being AI at some point.
Sure, right.
Even this podcast, perhaps. People
Well,
will think this is just a conversation between two AI bots.
right, and that's that level of where people cannot discern between what is AI and what isn't, the way in which it affects all of their interactions, I think is concerning, as well as just, the way in which our interactions with AI, how are we being trained, how are we being trained when we interact with something that immediately responds or near immediately responds and never leaves, a chatbot can never respond with silence. It can never not respond. And so, how does that shape our interactions with other people? So, I think there's a lot of interesting questions with that.
Yeah, I just want to go back to one thing you said about how you try as hard as you can not to make any mistakes when you're performing, but at the same time, you like the fact mistakes exist.
Correct.
And
Yeah.
I think this is we can draw palindromes into this too,
Mhm.
because when you write a palindrome, you want it to be indistinguishable from a non-palindrome. You want it to sound as
Mhm.
clear and human as
Mhm.
possible. But at the same time, if you really wanted that, you wouldn't write a palindrome. So you
Right.
write a palindrome
Exactly.
knowing that it's going to come out messy. It's any palindrome that's longer than 10 words, there's going to be a little messy bit.
Exactly. There's some
So
sort of you're making an allowance somewhere. You're giving up something for, you
yeah,
know, a segment that works really, really well. And if you're piling on the constraints, it becomes all the more challenging.
and
And
chaotic and messy. Yeah.
yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
So
Yeah,
it's
the chaos.
so in a way, yeah, in a way, by writing palindromes, you're doing exactly what you said about performing. You're trying your best to be perfect,
Hmm.
but embracing the imperfection.
Yeah, I think that's, and sometimes when I'm attempting things that are, the solution set is maybe just a little too small in terms of the possibilities. So it's again, I might not be all that pleased with the product, but it's not so much about the final product for me. It's about, the task of, solving this puzzle. Can I construct this using all of these various constraints and make it work pretty well? Again, it's, is this possible? Is what is nearly impossible, to construct something that is nearly impossible for me, that there's something so appealing about that process, regardless of what the final product may be. Sometimes I may be like, oh, that's not too bad actually, or sometimes like, yeah, but yeah,
And there's
that,
also
that that's
just
it.
interesting, like sometimes there are palindromes that aren't clean at all and
Hmm.
do not at all sound human, but there's something that draws you to them because there's something so weird about it. Because it's the kind of thing AI can't do, perhaps.
And it's combinations that, you would never put together,
Mm,
words that would never follow one another, certainly not in a token, in tokenization and prediction of an
yeah,
LLM. But that through this creative use of constraints and inventiveness, you're able to shape these things, and different constraints, have different kind of a feel to them. It's almost like the difference between single letter palindromes and double letter palindromes. They
yeah,
really have a different feel.
different voice. Which I
Hmm.
think about all constraints have a different voice.
Yes,
That
exactly. Yeah.
the anagram has its own voice, the lipogram has
Hmm.
its own voice.
Yes.
Very, yeah. I just find all this fascinating, as you know, and you find it fascinating too.
Yes.
I hope the listeners do, otherwise they might turn off by this point. So, okay, so this is the last question. What advice would you give to someone looking to pursue a career in classical music?
So, I would say, what is often advised is that if one can or would like to do anything else, something else, anything else, and can see oneself doing it, do that. That's sort of the practical advice, just in terms of it being a very difficult profession, and extremely competitive profession. And to some extent, that is advice that I pass along. But I I think that, like the value of musical training, of a musical education is so useful regardless of any kind of field that one might find oneself in. And, to be able to do these creative projects, on a daily basis. Sometimes it can be a little grueling, but it's I think it's such a gift, and I think it's so important, regardless of what one might end up doing in terms of how one makes one's income. I think that the training is incredibly useful. I mean, I've had students who've become surgeons, doctors, gone into all sorts of different fields, administrative fields, everything. And it's not just the level of discipline that's involved in the training, but I think it's just the perspective and the focus on art, that is so important. And again, especially in this environment where we have such narrow definitions of value coming at us from political sources. And I think it's very important. And I do encourage my students to pursue careers, um, at the same time that I try to be very realistic with them about, the level of competitiveness and the amount of persistence that is necessary. Um, you don't go into it to make a lot of money. That's certainly not a good reason for going into the arts. But it provides many other forms of fulfillment, and I think that the skills are so transferable as well. So it's an unusual moment right now, and I don't know how long this current moment is going to last. For the performing arts, particularly for symphony orchestras. But I think it's very a very worthwhile field to pursue.
Yeah, here. Um, I've one of the best things I ever did with my life was learn to play guitar, and
Yeah.
I've made no money from it at all. But whenever I feel like it, I can pick up a guitar and play it, and I immediately feel 10 times better.
Right.
So
Right.
this is what we mean by value, really, isn't it?
Exactly. Exactly.
On that note, on that positive note. Laurie, thank you so much for doing this. This was a really nice conversation. It was so good to
Oh,
see you again.
well, it's wonderful to see you, and I really appreciate you having me here today.